the NYEUSI GOMA, making Eowyn the caretaker for Princess Myeko and her servant Domari, was the best decision Empress Shala could have made. Eowyn was dedicated, patient, intuitive, and demanding. She had all the attributes of a teacher and mentor, character traits that were desperately needed to raise a princess. To everyone in Nyansva there was only one princess, Myeko, the sole child and heir to the throne. She had a royal presentation ceremony on her 6th birthday, and the entire province of Nyansva came to know her name. She was bombarded with gifts and tokens of love from the entire kingdom. Myeko looked every bit the princess too. Eowyn had taught her well. She was polished, well-spoken, and carried the authority given her as easily as carrying a butterfly on her shoulders. As Myeko grew older, she was surrounded by even more doting servants, and became very comfortable giving orders. She was more relaxed at commanding those around her than Shaela. Myeko had a bossy side to her personality, but she was firmly rooted in innocence as well. To Shaela, it was reminiscent of a child happily playing with fire, completely unaware of its devastating power, until she got burned. More notable than any obvious behavior or action was that Myeko was extraordinarily beautiful. The features of her small, roundish face were soft and delicate. Her oval eyes glistened more than the rivers that flowed from the peaks of the Black Mountain. Her high cheekbones were perpetually rosy, and her smile won the hearts of everyone with whom she shared it. If anyone were born to be a princess, it would be difficult to deny Myeko was that person. Eowyn was an amazing custodian for Myeko and Domari. She was able to discern their individual needs as young girls from different worlds and different stations, and work with them without sacrificing time with the other child. She taught the girls how to walk with grace, speak with wisdom, and enjoy the fullness of life all around them. Eowyn's goal from the start was to help Myeko fulfill her responsibilities as an emperor's child, a princess. It was a role that Myeko fit into very comfortably. She quickly learned to behave with the grace of a princess, even at a young age. However, if anyone were to ever ask Eowyn, she would say she was raising 2 princesses, the second being Domari. Eowyn's caretaking efforts for Domari necessitated tweaking. Domari didn't require rote instruction or encouragement. She had the uncanny ability to observe and retain what she'd witnessed with eidetic comprehension. She also welcomed the opportunity to learn anything new. Domari had the natural grace and presence of a queen, even as a toddler, but she was unlike Shaela or Myeko. She did not stand on ceremony over royal protocols and etiquette. She greeted everyone as if they were family. Domari would rather manage the unmanageable herself than command someone else to handle a chore for her. Eowyn worked hard to stem Domari's natural-born regality so that she did not overshadow Myeko. The responsibility was difficult because tasks that were challenging for Myeko were often quite easy for Domari. Ultimately, as the years passed and Eowyn realized that bridling Domari's rapid social and intellectual growth was improbable, she simply asked the young girl to stop being so perfect. The most important role in Eowyn's job was to reaffirm the lie that Domari was an orphan. It was the only way to stop her from asking questions about the mother and father she never knew. Along with that lie, Eowyn taught Domari how to keep the color of her skin hidden. King Caelan was adamant so many years ago that he did not want Domari's dark brown skin to be seen or revealed. If Domari ever discovered that she was Shaela's natural-born daughter, and that the father she craved was actually the king, all hell would break loose. Caelan's unchecked fury would rain down upon everyone, the thought of which was something that gave Eowyn and Shaela nightmares. They had to keep Domari's birth a secret, for everyone's sake, So Eowlin made gloves, a hooded cloak, and veils, especially for Damarie. She would wear these accessories along with her robe to keep her face and arms covered. In the past 12 years, only Empress Shyla, Mieko, Eowlin, Loaiza, and Ping had seen Damarie without her hood and veil. Because Damarie spent so much of her waking life covered and in disguise, she instinctively sought and found beauty in the bareness of everything around her. From the majestic black lotus flowers to the fruit trees, the blue sky and the warm sun that bathed the inner courtyard of Nyensvik Castle, Damarie craved the freedom to bask in the beauty of everything around her. But under Eowlin's tutelage, she had to stifle those feelings. Among other skills she possessed, Eowlin was also an artist. She taught calligraphy to Mieko as part of her royal training, and after much needling and whining, agreed to teach Damarie as well. Shyla didn't think much of it, because in Nyansvarti women were not known to be writers or storytellers. Mieko would probably never require the skill of calligraphy in her royal duties, but it was the right of the king's family to learn the art, and was a gift she could bestow upon her future son. If the chances of Mieko using the skill were virtually nil, there would surely be no harm in Damarie learning the trade, as she would definitely never be called upon to write anything. Calligraphy was taught in a royal drawing room just inside the entrance of the castle, near the inner courtyard. The room was one of many secret rooms in the castle, created by designers for the sake of showing their architectural prowess. Unlike other secret rooms, this room was soft, with vibrant yellow walls with white and green trim, rich mahogany wood beams across the ceiling, polished marble columns, and a plush mat for sitting. Candles were stacked in layers along the sides of 3 walls, creating a soft glow that was soothing. Jasmine and vanilla smoldered in ceramic pots placed in each corner of the yellow room. The lingering scent was believed to inspire artistry or hunger, whichever was needed at the time. Eowlin would instruct the girls and then leave them in the room for an hour as she finished her other chores. When she returned, she'd grade their work, and the children were granted playtime in the courtyard. Damarie especially loved writing time, because it was one of the few times and places within the castle where she could remove her cloak, hood, and veil, and be free. Inside the drawing room, Mieko sat on her knees with a thin ink brush in hand as she stared at a blank piece of rice paper on the table. She wore a purple and yellow royal tunic and white stockings. Her yellow slippers were situated at the corner of the room. Damarie faced Mieko from the opposite end of the table. She wore a grey robe with black trim, black ribbon belt, and a black bow. Once Callan saw her wearing red and green, and forbade her from wearing any colours the princess would wear. She had a thin brush in hand as she eagerly pushed aside a stack of rice paper filled with perfectly drawn characters and symbols. Her face was aglow with wonder as she happily studied her work, and flickering candlelight added a shimmer to her dark brown skin. Mieko rolled her eyes as she dipped her brush into a bottle of ink and touched the rice paper. From the black dot on the paper, she drew an arching character and stopped midway. She set her brush aside and leaned back. She coughed loudly to grab Damarie's attention. Damarie studied the annoyed expression on Mieko's face. "What's wrong, Mieko?" she asked. "I hate writing," Mieko protested. "It bores me." Damarie scooted up from the table and sat beside Mieko. She had a sheet filled with elegantly drawn characters in hand. "Boring?" she repeated. "How can you not see the beauty of each stroke? Imagine the grand tales we can write!" There was a familiar excitement in her voice. Generally, Damari was excited about nearly everything. Mieko mentally plotted to take advantage of that. She needed a cohort to get out of writing, and since Damari was her best friend in the whole kingdom, why not her? Mieko leaned in closer. Why write tales when we can live them? Live them? Damari's interest was piqued, and she had no clue Mieko was merely teasing. How? She demanded. Mieko grabbed Damari's hand as if preparing to flee. Let us run away from here, far away. She stood to her feet and grasped Damari by each shoulder to emphasize the urgency. We shall start our own kingdom where there are no adults and no calligraphy classes. Damari studied her faux pained expression for a moment and then started to chuckle. Mieko joined in, having a hearty laugh at how far she managed to take the joke. I almost had you convinced this time, Mieko stated proudly. The idea that you continue to find pleasure in teasing me is confounding, Damari agreed. However, I caught on to your trickery much earlier this time. I think not. Mieko disagreed with a smile. The girls chuckled again until the door swung open and Eowyn stormed in. Their smiles quickly disappeared. When Shyla gave birth to Damari and Mieko was stolen from Luli, Eowyn was a 16-year-old girl being raised by her grandmother, Loaiza. 12 years had passed since then. Now Eowyn was a woman, and she'd be raised under the auspices of strong women like Shyla and Loaiza. She was a servant, but she learned quickly that some things were right and other things were wrong. She had no problem speaking about things that were wrong. With the girls, Eowyn had learned how to employ effective ratios of discipline, strictness, and encouragement. Now, as the girls stood chuckling and Mieko's work lay incomplete, it was surely the right time to evoke discipline. The girls stood aside as Eowyn loomed over their work, making no effort to hide her displeasure. Mieko was a princess, but Eowyn was her caretaker, and was given full authority to dispense punishments as necessary, within reason. Eowyn looked at traditional punishment as the antithesis to growth. She needed to help Mieko and Damari grow. Surely there would be a time when they needed each other and would be forced to rely on the strength of the other. Eowyn planned to make sure that the girls were ready when that day came. Eowyn turned to Mieko with a hint of scorn in her eyes. Much is expected of a Princess Mieko, she chastised. Yes, Eowyn, Mieko whispered. With Eowyn, Mieko never relied on her royal heritage to get away with anything. She gave Eowyn the same respect she gave her mother. Mieko was heartbroken whenever she felt she disappointed Eowyn. Eowyn turned away, trying to keep the smile from forming on her face. She hated having to torture the child, but was raising a princess by any means necessary. She lowered her eyes to survey the piles of rice paper covered from header to footer with elegant writing. She allowed herself to smile at Damari's masterful penmanship. You shall remain until you master this assignment. Eowyn's command was directed at Mieko. Damari, you are free to leave. The queen is waiting in the courtyard. Mieko pouted and stomped her feet. Why does Damari roam freely while I stay and practice? Eowyn turned a stern eye to Mieko. She held up the poorly written paper. From the appearance of this, practice is required of only one of you. Do you see who that person might be? Mieko shrugged, slumped down and sat again, with her legs tucked beneath her. She knew better than to argue with Eowyn. It was a losing proposition, as Eowyn was better at debating than many men who stood on the King's social council. She grimaced as Eowyn marched to the door and turned back. "Dalmori!" she called. "You must don your hood, cloak, and veils before you see the Queen." Eowlin shut the door behind her as Mieko pouted over her poor penmanship. She frowned at the glaring contrast in the two examples of calligraphy. Her heart sank. There was no way she could ever compete with Dalmori in art. She would need weeks, maybe months of training separated just to begin at the same level. Again, it was a losing proposition. Dalmori pulled the dark linen cloak over her torso as she watched a figurative cloud of despair rumble above Mieko. Next, she slid the hood over her head and tugged black silk veil down to tuck the rest of her face into shadow. Finally, she slipped her hands into charcoal-colored gloves that rose to her elbows. Dalmori moved with the ritualistic precision of someone who had completed the movements 1,000 times. When she was done, not an inch of her skin was exposed. Dalmori started for the door, but stopped. The air in the yellow room had become heavy with despair, and she sensed Mieko's eyes on her. With a heavy sigh, she turned back and sat at Mieko's side. Wordlessly, Dalmori took Mieko's hand, maneuvered her closer to the ink, dipped the brush, and started to guide her through the calligraphy strokes. "We shall see the Queen together," Dalmori said, without meeting her eyes, but concentrating on the hand stroke to make a symbol that made Mieko gasp softly. "Sister," Mieko whispered, as she fought internally to stifle the emotion welling up inside of her. She leaned closer to rest her head on Dalmori's shoulders. "Of course," she said, touched by the sentiment, as she allowed Dalmori to guide her through the brushstroke. The village of Midremgalos was burning. The village was poised in a valley 60 miles southwest of Nyansveachachi Castle, a 4-hour journey by horse. It was a trade village where craftsmen, farmers, seamstresses lived and worked, selling and bartering goods. There were no warriors or battle-hardened elders in the village. Even politics played little role in how the village was managed because there was so little there. The townspeople were easy-going folk who worked hard during the day and told fantastic stories to each other at night, at community bonfires over freshly roasted pig, potato and leek soup, and hot tea. Many of Midremgalos's barns, trading posts and thatch roof huts were afire. The streets looked like a war zone. Arrows were impaled in walls, battle axes and Gean swords were scattered about. Burning wagons were toppled on their sides as oxen roamed free. The roads were filled with the dead and dying, men, women, and children sprawled in the streets. They were all residents, whose bodies were scattered across dirt roads, rice fields, and alleys. Mournfully watching the gory spectacle were those who rode the razor's edge and survived. The ragged, the bloodied, the wounded, and the violated sat clutching lifeless bodies, sobbing and mourning the sudden and brutal loss of husbands, wives, and children. Just moments earlier, the defenseless village had been ruthlessly and savagely attacked, decimated within minutes, and left for dead. Midremgalos was a farming village 30 kilometers north of the Nyansveachachi Castle, tucked in a fertile valley at the eastern range of the Black Mountains. There was nothing special about Midremgalos. The village was an ad hoc assembly of barns, shops, and homestead houses claimed on a first-come, first-served basis. The aged wood used to construct the buildings decades ago had been bleached grey by the sun and years of extreme weather. The farmers worked day and night to tend to their fields and produce enough crops to support their families and sell to the larger cities of the Nyansveachachi province. Farmers wore traditional grey clothes to work in the fields, run blacksmithing shops, and manage outposts and taverns. The mist from nearby fields tended to linger in the streets, giving the dull village grey overtones to match the dull, grey ambiance. There was nothing special about Medremgalos, and that's what made the city special. There was no class system, no royalty, no politicians, and no one left behind. The city cared for its own people. They were neutral, opting not to take sides in any of the wars that plagued the province in the past. They paid homage and taxes as necessary and on time. Other villages that constantly fought internal wars over crime, political corruption, and murder respected the citizens of Medremgalos. Medremgalos had become the epitome of steadfastness, and now the village was burning to the ground. At the far edge of town, where the central road met with the edge of the forest before it turned north towards the Hong Valley, Moon, a cold-hearted warlord, sheathed his bloody sword. Behind him, a small army of savage raiders marched their horses into the woods, their thirst for blood thoroughly quenched by the villagers of Medremgalos who lost their lives that day. Mern was a powerful man, tall, wide-shouldered, and wore his head shaved clean, except for a ponytail that extended from just above the center of his forehead and down to his knees. Moon swore he would only cut his hair when he lost a fight. He hadn't cut his hair in 12 years. Thrones for the king and queen stood at the head of the inner courtyard. The king's throne was barely touched and nearly immaculate. The throne for the empress, however, was showing signs of wear and tear. Over the years, the inner courtyard had become a place of respite for Shaila. It was her escape from the king and a retreat from the responsibilities of a queen. The inner courtyard had become the only other place in the kingdom, besides her bedroom, where Shaila could be a mother. If the inner courtyard was a welcome retreat for Shaila, it was a slice of heaven for Darmori. Here, as Shaila sat comfortably poised on her throne, and as Eowyn stood by her side, Darmori could play with Mieko like children, without her confining cloak, hood, and veil. The chocolate brownness of her face, arms, legs, and feet was wide open, exposed. In the inner courtyard, Darmori wasn't a servant or an orphan. Here she was simply free. Freedom for the girls meant running around barefoot, playing tag, hide, and go-seek, laughing loudly, cackling like geese, yelping with mock surprise, and hugging each other with reckless abandon. Mieko was free to forsake poise and royal presence. In the inner courtyard, she wasn't a princess or the daughter of the king and queen. She was a mischievous adolescent child who loved to laugh and adored soft, pretty things. And so, the girls trotted around, chasing each other back and forth, giggling, stumbling, and making up new games as the day went by. They were content, and Shaila was happy to see her girls were relaxed and enjoying life as a child. 3 servants, the triplets He Young, Hua Zhuang, and Hyo Son, stood behind Shaila and Eowyn, and also watched as Mieko and Darmori played among the gardens in the inner courtyard. A year earlier, Shaila expanded the close-knit circle of people who had seen Darmori's brown skin. The task of keeping Darmori's secret was becoming more difficult for Loaiza, Eowyn, and Shaila to manage alone, so Shaila sent for her most trusted servants and introduced them to Darmori one by one. The triplets were the perfect allies. They thought and behaved as one. It made communicating the delicate issue of Darmori's restrictions easier. Hyoung, Hua Zhuang, and Hyo Son were sworn to secrecy and monitored to see how they reacted to Darmori's skin color, a color richly different from their citron complexions. Shala's reservations were short-lived. The triplets gravitated toward Darmori with warmth and understanding she'd only witnessed in Eowyn. They adored how this little umber-skinned girl, an outsider and orphan, still made them feel connected, welcomed, and appreciated. More than anything, the triplets attributed Dalmorie's lustrous dark skin to one thing, the legend of the Black Lotus. They knew in their hearts that she was the promise. As the girls continued to romp in the courtyard, Shyla pondered over a small clay plate piled an inch high with silvery silkworm cocoons. She used carved ivory chopsticks to dip each cocoon into a small cup of hot water. When she removed the silver pods, they unraveled into a thin, silky filament. She tugged at the end until the filament extended a foot, and then handed the pod to an awaiting servant. She didn't look up when she heard the girls yelp. "Whoa!" "Be careful," she said, with her eyes still focused on the silkworm. "Eowlin will scold you if you skin your knees." "We will, Mama!" Mieko exclaimed. "Yes, my lady!" Dalmori answered. The formality of Dalmori's words irked Shayla, and she looked up at her daughter playing in the gardens. Things seemed to move in slow motion as she watched Dalmori, her brown, delicate feet, her shimmering skin, and her curly, shoulder-length black hair. She was looking at her child, the true princess, but no one knew it. Worse, she had to maintain her distance with formal ceremony and etiquette. Doing so hurt every fiber of her being, but she knew deep down that it would crush her if her child were not close. She tried to mask her inner misery with a smile. "Thank you," she uttered as her lips quivered. Mieko was futilely chasing Dalmori when she suddenly stopped and struck a dance pose. Her feet were hip-width apart as she tucked her belly in, shifted her weight onto left leg, extended and pointed the toe of her right leg, reached upward with her right arm, and extended her left arm to shoulder height. "Dalmori, look at me!" she yelled. Dalmori skid to a stop and turned back. Her eyes were aglow with wonder as Mieko bowed and began a ritual dance that was slow and methodical. The dance was choreographed beautifully, and Mieko worked hard to be graceful, but she struggled with the strength moves and leaps. It didn't matter to Dalmori. She was fixated on every step and proudly watched Mieko finish and bow. Dalmori ran to Mieko's side and hugged her. "That was beautiful," she squealed. "What is it called?" "It is the NYEUSI GOMA," Mieko happily replied. "It is a sacred dance the daughter of a king must perform on her 18th birthday." Meanwhile, Shayla watched with pride. Her daughter, her other daughter, was growing up to be a fine princess. She turned to Eowlin. "Mieko has 5 years before she must perform the NYEUSI GOMA. It is early to begin her training, do you think?" "It is very early, my lady," Eowlin replied confidently. "But, given the challenges of Mieko's artistic abilities, I thought it best to begin now." Eowlin's statement worried Shyla, and now she looked at Mieko with concern. Kaelin could be a proud and unforgiving man. If he had a moment's hesitation about having the ceremony for Mieko to perform the NYEUSI GOMA, he would make life difficult for everyone. Worse, if he learned that Mieko could not master it, he would torture here with endless training. Eowlin could sense Shayela's trepidation. "She will master the NYEUSI GOMA, my lady," she reassured the queen. "Of that I have no doubt." Shayla trusted Eowlin with everything. If anyone could help Mieko master the difficulty of the NYEUSI GOMA, Eowlin could. As Shayla smiled with relief, Mieko ran to her and bowed. "Did you like it, Mother?" she quizzed expectantly. "It was excellent, my dear," Shyla said as she bent over to hug Mieko. What Mieko lacked elsewhere, she made up for in her desire to please. Yes, she would work hard to master the NYEUSI GOMA. Of that, Shyla had no doubt. "You and Eowlin offered quite the surprise for me," Shyla added. "Thank you. I shall cherish this day." Miko took a moment to proudly bask in her mother's appreciation. Then she ran to a large silk purse and began to rummage through it. Damari raced to her side to see what delightful things Miko would reveal next. She gasped when Miko removed bamboo batons with vibrant red silk ribbons attached. "It is much more difficult with the ribbons," Mieko exclaimed sadly. She had tried it before in solitude and wouldn't dare attempt it in front of an audience. She turned to Damari with a mischievous grin. "You try it!" Her words were more like a dare than a command. "Mieko!" Eowlin barked from across the courtyard. She quickly moved from Shayla's side and marched toward Mieko. The little princess knew she was in trouble and stepped behind Damari for cover. "Why do you seek to taunt Damari?" Eowlin admonished. She was upset. She'd seen this behavior in Mieko before, and it was becoming tiresome. "We spoke of this. The dance is taught to the princess only. Damari has not been shown, and does not know it." Damari stepped forward and laid her hand softly on Eowlin's hand to calm her. "But I do, Eowlin," she exclaimed. "I do know it." Damari took the bamboo posts and the ribbons and walked confidently to the center of the courtyard. Eowlin looked back at Shayla for guidance and saw only surprise and a hint of fear in the queen's eyes. Young Huazhuang and Hyoson moved from behind the queen's throne to the edge of the courtyard for a closer look. Damari gracefully took her position. Her feet were also hip-width apart. Her weight shifted onto her left leg. Her right leg was extended and pointed outward with her toes perfectly pointed. She reached upward with her right arm as if she was trying to grasp the stars and raised her left arm to shoulder height just below her chin. Then she danced. And it was beautiful. Her moves were graceful and powerful, with an elegance seen only after years of training. Shayla carefully watched her. Damari's eyes had taken on a glossy sheen as the spirit of the dance took her away. She never looked as focused, as commanding, or as free as she did while she was dancing. She twirled the ribbons in what looked like endless circles. She leapt to amazing heights on her wiry legs. She performed pirouettes with ease, bounded into an elegant grand jeté, and slowed to a sensual plie. When she was finished, she bowed, and her eyes settled into her familiar, warm gaze. Mieko, the triplets and Eowlin just stared, mouths hanging open, eyes wide. They were dumbstruck. How could they have seen what they just witnessed? Shyla took an unsteady step, gathered herself, and wandered over, still in a daze. "I have never seen the NYEUSI GOMA dance executed so brilliantly." Her voice was a trembling whisper and full of awe. Shyla kneeled at Shyla's side. Her hands were still shaking. "How could you perform it so perfectly?" "I watched Mieko and remembered," Damari replied, matter of fact. "I saw it in my mind." Shayla stood again and wrapped her arms around the pleased little girl. Suddenly, movement across the courtyard caught her eye. It was Loaiza, rushing in, waving fearsomely. Shayla knew that look. The king was approaching. A chill ran up her spine. She pushed Damari away and held her firmly with 2 hands. Dharmari, you must don your hood now! She shouted in fear. She shot a horrified look over to the servants, who were already gathering the hooded cloak, veil, and gloves. But you said I do not have to wear the hood in the courtyard. Dharmari protested. Shayla ran to snatch the garments from Hyo-son. She turned back as Dharmari grudgingly sauntered over. Swiftly, child, she commanded. Eowlin had jumped into action now. She grabbed Dharmari from behind and carried her forward. Sharla and the triplets scrambled to cover Dharmari from head to toe with boots to cover her bare feet, a dark cloak to cover her body and head, a hood to mask her face, gloves to cover her arms, and a veil to hide her face, in shadow. They finished concealing Dharmari just as King Kaelin entered. The triplets rushed back to their places behind the throne. Eowlin pulled Dharmari to the side, reached for Mieko, but she dodged and escaped her grasp. Kaelin surveyed their panicked eyes as Mieko ran towards him. Father, you missed it, she exclaimed, but his stern eyes stopped her cold. You forget yourself, child, he admonished. Mieko took a step back and bowed deeply. Unseen by Kalin, Dharmari peered through her veil to see the king. Her actions were forbidden. Servants were not allowed to look directly at the king or queen. Still, Dharmari was drawn to Kalin. She thought he was the most beautiful man she'd ever laid eyes on, and she wanted to be close to him, even though she knew it would never happen. Greetings, father, Mieko said finally, when she'd performed the correct greeting ritual of bowing and waiting for the king's gesture, allowing her to speak. That is the way a princess greets a king, Kalin admonished. He was not one to let a failure go without correction. Never forget. Shyla moved to Mieko's defense, but her voice was still quivering from nearly being caught covering Dharmari's exposed skin. Kaelin. She should not be blamed for her excitement at seeing her father. Should she? As Shayla moved closer, she was visibly shaking, and this time Kaelin noticed. Why are you trembling? He demanded. Then he surveyed all of their pensive expressions. All of you twist your faces as if you have seen the eternal fires of Du. Have I interrupted something? No, my lord, Shyla explained. You merely brought in a chill from outside. Kaelin surveyed their faces again as the servants forced smiles. It didn't matter. He had no time for this. Let them be uncomfortable with his presence, he rationalized in his mind. I am the king. Your visit to the eastern province must be delayed, he said, discounting the coolness with which he had been received. Midremgalos was attacked. Men, women, and children were slaughtered. Only Narcian could be behind this heinous act. Sharla was taken aback by Kaelin's tone. He seemed only mildly interested in the attack on a village under his governance, but thrilled that his enemy, King Narcian, was the conspirator beside such dreadful actions. She knew better, but she had to tread lightly. There were decades of animosity between Kalin and Nation. She was the root cause of it. Tread lightly, she thought. King Narcian, attack a defenseless village? She tried to confirm without sounding too incredulous. Such villainy would be unlike him. Kaelin stared through her for a moment, his lips curled into sneer. Shayla could see his temper in play, and he was boiling over. Forgive me, my lord. She interjected, hoping she'd dismantled Kaelin's mounting anger before he responded in an explosive manner. I am sure I show my ignorance of the matters of war. Kaelin scoffed. He couldn't have said it better himself. Of course, Shayla would take Nashian's side against him, he thought. He visually scolded her with a condescending and incredulous shake of his head. He was not about to let the matter of her verbal challenge go unpunished. Perhaps a good queen would do better to leave understanding to those who are more apt to understand, he lectured. His words stung, not because she would never understand men's war strategies or battle plans. No woman in the kingdom had ever seen the ravages of Kaelin's brutal wars up close. Shayla was no exception. Kaelin's words stung because of what he implied. Kaelin had always condescended to Shayla, accusing her of misunderstanding his manly needs. He accused her of being a poor wife and an even poorer queen. She didn't provide him with a true child, and she didn't understand his strategies for conquering his enemies. Shayla knew that in many ways she would never measure up to what Kaelin wanted, and perhaps her mere existence was enough to infuriate Kaelin. But there was something that kept him engaged and connected to her, and she was clueless as to what that was. Of course, Shayla agreed as she rolled her eyes. If the king says it is Nasien who has committed such an atrocious act of war, it must be true. Kaelin ignored her sarcasm. Unseen by Shayla and Callan, Dalmori had ignored royal protocol and etiquette, and lifted her head and thus her eyes towards the king, seeking to see his face and his eyes in full glory. She was enamored with her king. He was majestic, powerful, and larger than life. Every time she laid eyes upon him, she felt her heart warm with adoration. She studied each micro-expression on his face, committing them to memory so she'd know exactly how Kaelin was feeling at the time. Angry, solemn, lonely, confident. Dalmori even mimicked his expression, sitting by the courtyard looking at her reflection in the water fountains. She was amazed at how well she could frown, grimace, or even smile exactly like the king. She wanted to feel that warmth in her heart again, and so she continued to stare at Kaelin, even though she could clearly see the other servants keep their heads low and their eyes down. It didn't matter. Now was her chance. She had to keep looking. Kaelin turned away from Shayla with the typical smug expression he exhibited when he knew he'd injured her spirit. Perhaps one day he might break her, and she would become the submissive, doting wife she was meant to be. He smiled at Mieko and spun on the heel and ball of his foot to go in the opposite direction. His eyes meet Dalmori's eyes. She locked onto him for a moment. She was mesmerized. Then she realized what she had done. She quickly turned away. Kaelin seemed to slow burn to a boil right there in his footsteps. He spun towards Shayla and pointed an accusing finger. "How dare she look me in the eye?" he admonished. "Does this servant need to be reminded of her place?" His words thundered in the courtyard, and Dalmori was frozen in fear. She didn't know if she should run or protest, but the other servants had already moved to her side and pulled her behind them. Meanwhile, Shayla's maternal instincts automatically kicked in. She moved within inches, or Kaelin's pointed finger, and locked eyes with him. It is natural for a child to be curious about someone with whom she feels a connection, Shayla enlightened him. Servants have no connection to the king, Kaelin chastised, or to the queen. It was a warning. You would do well to remember that. It shall be done, my lord. Shayla bowed respectfully, content that Kaelin would leave the situation alone. She'd learned that the quickest way to squelch the king's anger toward the liberties she'd taken with Dalmori was to subliminally attack his subconscious and remind him that he was in fact Dalmori's father. As Kaelin departed, Shyla cast a stern eye at Dalmarie, who had cowered behind the adult servants, seeking protection from her angry king and queen. The queen's bedchamber was a magnificent suite with 3 open-air rooms and a raised platform for the queen's extra-large bedset near the window. The bed could easily fit 5 people and was made with silk sheets and luxurious mink blankets. When the sun rose in the morning, its gentle rays would pierce the landscape and fall gently on Shyla's face. There was a bedroom, a dressing room, and a sitting room. Rise paper screens and colourful mats were set up along the length of the room, celebrating the different seasons and the colours associated with each. There were yellow and rust colours for fall, multiple shades of green for spring, off-white for winter, and 7 hues of gold for summer. The colours reminded Shyla to look for the differences of each season and accept their limitations, much like she did in life. Magnificent floral arrangements were set in strategic corners of the room. Her favourites were black lotus, yellow tulips, and purple saffron. Shyla's bedchamber was her retreat from the world and from Callan. The last time he stepped into her bedchamber was before Dalmarie was born. Now his presence in the room was just a memory, as was his touch. Shyla made a point of resolving all family issues before she stepped into the suite. She believed that the negative energy carried through bad thoughts lingered, and she didn't want those thoughts invading her dreams. As Shyla stormed in with Mieko and Dalmarie behind her, she was thinking that there was a major family issue to resolve. Shyla glowered as she did an about-face and locked eyes with Dalmarie. There was such darkness in her eyes and her expression so taut that it scared Mieko away. Dalmarie wanted to avoid her eyes but couldn't. There was something else in Shyla's expression. Shyla was afraid. Seeing her like this made Dalmarie embarrassed. Her compulsion to watch the king, even when she knew she shouldn't, did this to the one woman who had loved her since, as far back as she could remember. Instead of being afraid of Shyla's hot gaze, she was guilt-ridden. "I am truly sorry, my lady." Dalmarie bowed and then kneeled, staying low. "What has gotten into you, child?" Shyla demanded. She was not about to allow Dalmarie to escape a severe chiding. "It is not wise to annoy the king, and you must never delay when I beckon you to don your hood and veil." "Never." "I only wanted to see his face," Dalmarie whispered sheepishly. She was still kneeling and hadn't looked up to meet Shyla's eyes. Shyla shouted, "His face does not matter!" It was clear. The fear she'd felt at Kaelin's sudden appearance in the inner court had transformed into anger. The shrill of her rising voice shocked her into sudden awareness. She wasn't angry with Dalmarie. She was upset with herself for allowing her daughter to be mistreated in a manner that turned her stomach. The daughter of a king being treated like a servant. Worse, there was no gentler soul in the kingdom than Dalmarie, but Kaelin has rebuffed all her attempts to honor him with love. At that moment, Shyla wished she could kill Kaelin with her bare hands. His death would bring relief for many people in the kingdom. The irony was, the one person who'd benefit the most from his absence was the one person who'd miss him the most. Dalmarie. The notion softened her mood. Why shouldn't Dalmarie be enamored with her father? Aren't daughters supposed to feel this way toward their dads? Here, Dalmarie's father was more than a commoner. He was a king. Loving him and adoring him was in Dalmarie's blood. It was not her fault. Shyla took Dalmarie's hand and guided her to her feet. She wrapped her arms around Dalmarie and pulled her closer and tightly into her bosom. "My dear," she said softly, "the king's rules are not to be disobeyed. I have witnessed his punishing rage set upon my own guardsmen. It is not something I desire for you." They locked eyes again, and Dharmari felt relieved. There was love in the Queen's eyes, and this was an expression Dharmari had come to expect and relish. Shala took a deep, calming sigh. The worst was over, and she was glad. She derived no pleasure from anger, even against Kaelin or Falson. In truth, she knew she'd rather feel fear than anger. Anger had the potential to be truly uncontrollable once unleashed. Fear might have the same qualities, she mused, but no one gets hurt except the person who's afraid. Shala sat down on the edge of her bed and patted the spot next to her with a flat palm. Dharmari scooted up beside her. She watched Dharmari hold her brown hand against her own ivory skin. The gesture felt odd. Dharmari had never before mentioned anything about the obvious difference in skin colors. Now she was making a visual comparison. Shala gently grasped Dharmari's hand and kissed the back of it. "Dharmari, my love," she stated calmly, "you are so fearless. I swear one day your boldness will pluck my heart from my chest." Dharmari reached up to comfort Shala and gently laid her hand upon the Queen's cheek. The contrast of brown and ivory skin gave her pause for a moment as she gazed with fascination at the difference between her hand and Shyla's cheek. "What the king said is true," Dharmari uttered matter-of-factly. "What did he say?" Shyla questioned. Dharmari looked her in the eyes and stated with complete confidence, "I am cursed." Shayla leapt from the bed and pointed her delicate finger at Dharmari. She was angry again. "Never utter those words again," she demanded. "The king is confused. Someday he will see that you are special." Dharmari nodded, but she was not convinced. "If I am special, where is my mother and father? Why is there no one waiting to love me?" Shyla's heart sank. Dharmari couldn't be more alone if she was at the opposite side of the world, yet they were only inches apart. She was wrapped in a cocoon of solitude made of the cloak, veil, and hood Kaelin forced her to wear. Shyla's maternal instincts kicked in, and she wanted to comfort Dharmari like any mother who witnessed their child's obvious pain. "You do have a mother and father," Shyla wanted to say. "You have someone who has loved you from the start," she screamed inside her head. But she couldn't say it aloud. It was too risky. Her instinct to protect Dharmari had to include treading lightly so as not to stoke the king's manic rage. A gauntlet of emotions overwhelmed her, each tugged at a different heartstring and reinforced the truth. They were stuck. There was no way out. Shyla pulled Dharmari into her bosom and cried. Dharmari was shaken. She'd never seen the queen shed tears before. She was always stoic, even when bad news came from the outlying villages. "Why do you cry, my lady?" Dharmari probed. "I cry for the truth, dearest," Shyla announced. "I fear that when it springs forth it shall be an agonizing pain, a pain you are not ready to bear, my love." Tears rolled down Dharmari's face as she tenderly wiped Shyla's cheek. "It hurts my heart when you cry. Can we be happy again?" Shyla chuckled and cleaned her face with a swipe of her palms. "Yes, we can," she replied. "But know this, no family, no person in this world could love a child more than I love you." Mieko eased out of hiding to witness her mother and her servant locked in a tender visual embrace. She paused for a moment to understand the depth of feeling that had elapsed, and while she was not fully mature enough to comprehend it all, she did understand Dharmari's loneliness. She often wondered how she might fare if she did not have a loving mother and powerful father around to love and guide her. "Can we be Dalmori's family?" Mieko asked. The question raised Dalmori's eyebrows. As much as Dalmori loved Mieko and Shyla, she was always aware that she was only a servant, not family. Now, the idea of being accepted by the queen and princess brought joy to her heart and a sparkle to her eyes. She was speechless. She could only nod emphatically. Shyla waved Mieko closer, proudly kissed her forehead and took her hands. "Yes, it will be our special family secret. No one else shall know." The three women embraced for the first time as a family. Shyla was a mother with 2 daughters. They were sisters.